Yeah, so welcome to the English final of the Pan American Debating Championships 2019. In opening government, we have USAFA A. Opening opposition, we have UIMONA B. In closing government, we have Morehouse A. And in closing opposition, we have Middlebury A. Chairing the panel today is Bexley Black-Brown of many universities, but currently the University of Vermont. Then we also, on the panel, we have Kiana from McGill, Sebastian from Mexican country, Dan from Tel Aviv, and Bele from MX East. Cool. So the motion today has an info slide. The info slide reads as follows. In Ecuador, the Constitution enshrines nature with the right to exist, persist, maintain, and regenerate its vital cycles. It allows people to bring forward lawsuits on behalf of nature. The motion for the finals of Pan Am's 2019 is this House supports countries granting rights to nature.
Can everyone hear okay? It's like this. As probably the last speech in my debating career, I just want to give a quick 5-second shout out to my partner Sarah Wyatt for getting me everywhere, and I love her, and I'm really happy to be in finals. And so, I can stop there and be really happy, but I'm really proud of her and she's an amazing woman. So thank you, Sarah. Okay, now to get to what we all probably wanted to talk about, right? At the point where we think, we talk more about Notre Dame burning, and we talk more about other things happening in our world today, besides discussing that island nations like Nauru in the Pacific are losing land every single day, sea levels are consistently rising, our polar ice caps are melting, and we literally have the most amount of kids with asthma because we can't figure out how to get cars that stop polluting. We think that we need to change. And the best way to do this is to give nature a protection and a mechanism to defend itself. Because at its core, nature is defenseless, we treat it like it's defenseless, and we're not doing anything to protect it. We think that this house is general society, and ultimately we think that countries are going to get this ratification through their own processes, through how individual countries want to ratify their constitutions, that will be it. Ultimately, we think we get a fiat ability to have it be passed. And ultimately what this looks like is when this right is violated, citizens, an individual citizen, activist, what have you, an advocate for nature can now advocate for nature in legal and political systems in a way that they did not have access to before. Two things I'm bringing you today, panel, in this speech. The first is the principled discussion of why nature deserves this right, and the second is how we're ultimately going to get the most practical impacts in this debate, because I think that opening opposition is going to agree that we have to do something. I think the debate is going to be what do we do and what is most effective. First, principally, why do we think countries have an obligation to provide nature a right? Two reasons. The first is that the state has a simple obligation to protect its citizens. This is unified and created in the social state contract that you enter when you enter into a state or a society, etc. We think that other citizens and other international actors have been degrading and violating the environment, and that ultimately hurts a state's citizenry and a citizen's ability to engage in that state. Why is this so? It's because we see the decisions of a few affecting all, and affecting citizens at large. And we think that currently the state, and states in general, are not stepping in. Why is this so important? It's because the state's citizens are reliant on the environment to engage in society and to literally sometimes just live. Couple of just examples, right? We think that on island nations, you have fishing communities that are literally losing access to water. Or you can look at the fact that there are towns in Bangladesh that literally have been flooded, and now the main economic system is other towns towns to go in and take the rubble that once was a city, and that's where they get their economic prosperity now. We also think, like, in order to breathe, you need good oxygen. So when people are polluting your air because they don't get the right cars, or you don't have emission checks, literally the state is failing its citizens by allowing this violation of a citizen's rights and ability to like live and function properly. Is ultimately, oh, no thank you. Is ultimately the reason why we think the state is justified and ought to and principally should grant these rights to the environment. But we also think countries are failing to uphold their burden to citizens now because we prioritize pretty much everything else over the environment, whether that's Notre Dame or whether it's like economic reasons or literally anything. So why do we think we need codified rights? And this is a principled impact because codified rights, when they're constitutionalized, now become at the center of every single conversation. What happens? Rights are key because it's the only mechanism that we have placed via a constitution, because your rights are the foundations of society. It dictates how and in what ways we engage, how and in what ways we talk to each other, we engage in business practices, economic practices, and just communal societies, right? Or in communal ways. Why is this so important? It's because principally when we give the environment a right, it means every single law you ever pass has to go through a test. That test is it constitutional? No, thank you. What we add now by giving the nature this right is whenever you pass any law, whenever you engage in any conversation, you say, is it constitutional? Does it violate any rights? If the answer is yes, you stop doing that. If you want to continue to offshore oil rig and like degrade the environment in unnecessary ways, we think now we're giving the environment a mechanism to fight back and people to fight back on its behalf. But now we're changing the whole way politicians and governments ever engage in the environment because it's a question they will always have to ask. And we posit panel, even if nothing changes, at least we codify a right for the environment, which is better than nothing, which is better than the status quo. Before I get on to my practical impacts, do I have any POIs? I'm sorry, I really can't see you guys, but do you have any POIs?
Yeah, don't you think that constitutional entrenched rights are not flexible enough to deal with ever evolving environmental problems?
So I think that as written in the info slide, they were very broad for a reason. It was the ability for nature to be able to engage in its natural cycle. So I think that would be what these rights would look like, is to just be able to protect and to prevent the degradation of nature as a whole. Second point, practically, which I think is where a lot of the debate as well will focus, right? Is because we think that, at its core, the Earth is pretty defenseless. Like, it's really sad we treat it as bad as we do when we, rely on it for so many things, right? It's pretty much innocent, and it cannot advocate. Like, I think the only thing it does wrong is it sometimes exists, and then we, take advantage of it, which is pretty sad, right? So the status quo is where you need collective action to change. In the status quo, it's really, really hard as an individual to get people to care about environmental problems because oftentimes the people committing those problems aren't ever facing the effects of environmental concern. Why is collective action so hard, and why do we have to get this to change? Why do we do that? A couple of reasons collective action is so challenging. One, you need just more money, more time, more people, more interest to be able to get enough collective action to currently lobby your congressmen or senators, get enough change to get legislation passed, go through lobbying groups, etc. We think outside, on our side, we get an immediate action that can take place and that any individual can take place. And this is so important because oftentimes the environmental concerns that affect most of us aren't being felt by those who are committing them, right? We also think we can get access to collective action on our side, but we think that ultimately giving an individual the ability to act is so, so important. So what are the impacts we get on our side of the house? We think we immediately change individual and corporate behavior, right? Because at the point where any individual can say, you are violating our right, you are violating nature's right, I'm going to advocate on their behalf, you're going to, one, get an incentive for corporations not to do that, to limit the amount of litigation and lawsuits they're going to have to face and fines, etc., and headache with dealing with courts. We also think too that we're changing the way that we interact with the environment from one person and from the corporation as a whole. So what are we giving to you on-site government? We gave you a principled argumentation why the environment deserves these rights, and then ultimately how practically this is going to benefit nature as a whole. I'm so proud to propose.
Invite the leader opposite. He's at the opposite position. You're here.
think the Prime Minister was generally clear on the idea of the debate that we need to protect the environment, and she was clear on why we need to do so. She wasn't clear on why we need to do so. But what we need to understand are the problems that are the origins of the problem, pardon. The problems arise because humans need to develop. Humans need to exploit their environment, they need to mine for resources, they need to drive cars to get around to work in order to make their lives better, in order to advance humanity. And of course, this will lead to environmental impacts. Now the question is, how bad are the environmental impacts and how can we best mitigate them? Now she said herself that we need to codify rights to entrench protection for the environment, right? But we pointed out that the problems the environment faces are very fluid and they can change from time to time. And then she went on to say that even if rights don't achieve anything, it's better than the status quo. We firmly reject this idea. We believe that if you instead strengthen and entrench rights for human beings, we'll do a much better job at protecting the environment. And I'll go into the many reasons why this is so, right? We believe that the prioritizing the rights of humans is most productive for long-term human and environmental sustainability. The first reason for this is because the best way to protect the environment, is to look out for humans. Let's look at an example of fracking. Nobody really knows the true consequences of fracking. They hear about the land subsidizing, they hear about water pollution, but they don't understand it. The situation really gets difficult and people really get connected to it when their water becomes poisoned, when their kids start to die and their kids start to get cancer. This is when the situation becomes important to you. So if we look at a right for a human to clean water, a safe environment, and a right for their houses not to sink into the ground, then we'll see that there's a much better chance of those environmental conditions being stopped. We could also look at the fact that people's view actually changes when these situations get close to them. So she would have mentioned sea level rise and so on. If you are not physically connected to the situation that's happening as an islander, it's much more easy to isolate it from your mind. But the moment it starts to come up into your side, then you begin to take action against it. Now, we could also look at land rights, right? Land rights can effectively protect fragile human and animal environments. We could look at, for example, in Brazil, where there's rapid deforestation. If those tribes in the Amazon were given rights over the land that they've owned for thousands of years, then we'll see that they'll be effectively able to combat the poachers and the deforestation that's taking place, right? So if the argument is countries really want to protect their environment, we believe that if they focus on looking at the human rights aspect, that is, protect the tribes and ensure that they are able to protect their land, that will do a much better job at protecting the environment than just giving the land itself rights. We could also look at Kenya, right? There are poachers in Kenya precisely because people invade the land of tribal groups, right? These tribal groups naturally exist in a state of balance with their environment. They don't want to harm the land. But the moment we start to encroach on their land, the moment we start to take it over, we realize that there's massive environmental degradation. If these groups had the rights and the means to protect themselves and their lands, we would not see so much environmental degradation that the government is trying to get rid of. Now, we could also see a situation where protection of human rights, where protection of environmental rights could actually be anti-developmental, specifically to the global south, right? Because some environmental degradation is necessary for economic growth and job creation. When you mine, the air gets polluted. When you mine, the land is removed and animal populations thereby are affected. This is something we cannot avoid, but we need it for there to be environmental growth and environmental development. And we believe that in the long run, after economies grow, countries can genuinely move from a state where they need to degrade the environment into a state where they're more sustainable. Alexa?
Yeah, so I'm a little unclear as to why there's a delineation between rights for nature and rights for humans, i.e. you can still solve the problem both ways. Why do we need to prioritize human rights when they can also be nature's?
I'll address your point later on, right? So we could look at the example of European countries, right? Right now, most of them, generally speaking, are at a high level of economic development and human development. For this reason, they can protect their environment. But if you look at countries in the global south, generally speaking, they don't have such a high level of development. They need to exploit their environment. They cannot sacrifice development. But in the long run, after they've achieved a certain level of economic development, they can have the resources necessary to protect their environment. Certainly there will be some level of degradation that persists into the future and that's never solved, but we believe that at the expense of that, it's better to have human growth and development in the long run. Now, we could also look at the fact that if we entrench rights for nature in certain countries, the multinationals that leave from those countries and go and operate elsewhere will need to now compete with multinationals that are not being held by the same rules. So if you have a British company competing with a Russian company for mining rights, the Russian company who does not have environmental rights in its constitution will not need to protect the environment of Sierra Leone, while the British company will need to do it, right? We believe that human rights for the people of Sierra Leone will do a much better job at protecting them because they are protected from anyone who comes in. But the Russian company will get the job because they can mine for cheaper and deliver more money to the government of Sierra Leone. Now, we heard from the government that the earth cannot advocate. I challenge that, right? Humans have been pumping carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, and in retribution, the earth has sent us 5 major hurricanes last year, and much more is willing to come, right? There are many things that are going to happen in the future. We could look at sea level rise, which is combating human impacts on the environment. We could look at the fact that if we poison the water, if we have an oil spill, we cannot eat the fish. We get cancer. That's the environment fighting back. The environment has existed for billions of years. Humans have only been around for hundreds of thousands of years. The environment wins. Full stop. Right? Now we could look at a quick cost-benefit analysis, and we believe that the rights of animals versus the impact of economic growth is far outweighed when we look at economic growth. As we said, in the long run, that gives us sustainability. And we believe, once again, that human rights must be prioritized, because even when we look at rights for the environment, as the Lower House would have said before, right? There is not any longer any discourse between the groups that are lobbying for environmental rights and the companies or governments that actually want to do something that may impact the environment. And we believe that this is counterproductive in the long run. I thank you.
We thank the leader opposition and invite the Deputy Prime Minister to close out the opening government meeting.
I'd like to start by thanking not only our coach, but also the tournament for happening, and my awesome partner who I've literally traveled the world with, and it's been fantastic, and I'm going to miss her. Because I'm going to miss debate as a community. Now I'm going to start my first and last speech, and I promise, unlike the fall that I just had, I have not been briefed. So, let's start with some rebuttal. So coming up from the last speaker, I think we heard a couple of things. First we hear essentially that why do we need to do so? They don't think that we get a response from Sam. And why specifically do we think this action is necessary? Why is it so necessary that we codify these rights? Why not only in these state laws? Because specifically, I think the future is that question. Because I think when you look at this right, fundamentally it can be seen as a collective right. If you only want to talk about humans and humans' rights being valued more so, we'd say thus it is even greater that we give rights to the earth, because giving rights to the earth essentially we think creates a collective right that all humans in the future, humans now and humans in the future, thus can experience. Because essentially if the earth is burning, we think that this essentially puts future humans at risk. Sometimes I think you give rights to areas and aspects that don't affect or benefit you, but it has side effects. The second, we think specifically that even if there are benefits, like essentially using economic advancement, et cetera, when those, we think oftentimes the harm to the environment oftentimes harm those individuals that are trying to engage in those advancements, and oftentimes the benefits that are made by those advancements are specifically those benefits are collected at the very top and not actually experienced by the majority of people. Specifically, we'd say underneath this, it's just because overfishing is a great strategy for now and allows a community to develop in a way that is but it is not sustainable. So what does it do? It first essentially puts additional pressures on future communities that have yet to make those decisions and removes their ability to make those decisions to engage in the environment because their decisions and their choices have been stripped from them. This we think is happening. We also think when you're talking about things like mining and development, this mining and development argument I think is frequently made by I feel individuals that want to essentially exploit this wealth. Because just because you build a factory doesn't mean that the humans that work in that factory are actually getting better with the earth. And I think it's because there's a fundamental misunderstanding when we talk about when humans somehow move to cities, is that they lose their historical ties to specifically the areas that provide for them, because essentially no longer is it so much that you like the land around you is something that how you live. You essentially are so removed from your environmental circumstance that the pollution, the degradation is not visible to you, because it is so easy to, I think, experience life external from it. I think there's a reason that when we talk about like tribal communities, like the Navajo tribe, and like specifically that like experience like the West and the U.S. specifically, they've always had like a historical relationship in which they viewed not only the earth but also the things on the earth as being sacred. I think that there is a move in the status quo where we no longer consider them valuable and we're willing to make economic progress above essentially preserving and protecting the earth. Why is this so fundamentally harmful? Sam tells you and engages in this analysis. It's because that we think if these resources were actually being exploited to benefit everyone equally, or benefit those people that are least worse off, then it would be okay, that it would be acceptable, but it's not. At the end of the day, it's the individuals that are producing these factories, that are making all this wealth, that are building the mines, tend not to share that wealth with other people. And we think that what they do share is essentially the pollution and the waste. Essentially, just because you have a Coca-Cola factory that exists in like Baja, I think it's Baja, California, I'm not quite sure, but literally where your pollution of water is essentially going downstream, the local community is not better off because their water sources that have been stolen so it can be put into a bottled plant. We think that this is the distinction on our side of the house. You don't actually help these people economically. Also, on the fact that the environment can protect itself, yes, maybe, right? So but I think in doing so, I don't really think it's protecting itself. Instead, I think that there are changes that happen to the environment that harm every living creature on it. Specifically when you have burning down fires, I don't think that essentially is the environment saying, stop doing these things. I think that is still a harm that happens to both those people and the environment. I'll take a question from closing if you have one.
Yeah, do you have an actual principled reason why we should value the environment over humans, or is everything still coming back to people in your house?
Okay. First, let's talk about my true extension, which is we're going to talk about some rights analysis. So fundamentally what we think in the status quo, you already have rights-based approaches, specifically like, let's say I want to engage in some type of action, like some rights override others, right? So specifically we would talk about, like my right to property doesn't essentially override your right to life. And so specifically we would say that there's an ability to differentiate between multiple rights. Just because you assign a right to something doesn't essentially mean that that becomes the like overarching hierarchy principle. It instead means that like you can have multiple rights that all engage with each other. I think this is a great understanding of like positive versus negative rights, right? So just because you could say like and engage in an argumentation that someone has the right to healthcare doesn't essentially mean that like how that person engages or gets access to that healthcare would be uniquely like exploitative, meaning like that they would have a right to like harm me in order to get access to what we'd say would be that positive right. But we think that you can actually have a ranking and stacking, which is what we think that the reason why we think this right is so fundamentally important is because at the end of the day we think it is a collective right that belongs to all of humanity, and it's something that we can only ensure by ensuring it on the earth first. And that was a very confusing statement. I will explain it. The first thing is that fundamentally that we think that oftentimes the costs are very hard to bear as individuals. Meaning like it's much harder to essentially say like this group has been harmed by Y, well we should not allow them to be harmed in this specific way, and like this group is harmed by another aspect, we should not allow them to be harmed in this specific way. Essentially like the environmental harms I think are experienced on an individual level that is very hard to like talk about unless you form and create a community-based right. Why is this so? It's because I think it is much easier to say that in general, Earth has rights, and these rights essentially allow us to protect the populations of largely humans that live upon them. Because when we say things like, yes, it is bad to do things to Earth water, so like water systems like polluted and essentially like, well, put chemicals into it, this protects the humans that live on those water sources because it essentially doesn't make those humans stand up and argue to legal courts why their specific rights to have clean water overrides the rights of the company to own and produce and engage in economic activity. Because essentially it does not, because we first have to engage in this environmental right that is harming all these people, because it essentially allows the environment to win, and thus the people to win. I think you need more analysis coming up from back half and the next speaker to tell us why specifically the protecting environmental rights is going to run counter to human rights, because we don't say that they're interlocked, so they belong together, and that promoting environmental rights is promoting human rights, because it's protecting the collective general human right, which we think allowing future generations to live and engage in good lives. Because fundamentally we think that there is a possibility to engage in like a rights-based analysis in which you can still have human rights and you can still have earth-based rights, but that doesn't essentially mean that like you have to concede one or the other. What have we brought to you from OG? Fundamentally we think it's responded to the case that having earth-based rights allows for people to actually engage in activism that doesn't have to be collective. Meaning that if I am harmed on an individual level, if the earth is harmed on an individual can take that through the legal and the political system, which allows them to access faster, more efficient, and better change. It also means that we essentially don't have to engage or pass laws or allow allow companies to act in ways that are uniquely destructive. We also think by codifying and engaging this principle-based rights approach, it helps us protect not only the environment, but also the people who live on it.
We thank the Deputy Prime Minister for their remarks. I'd like to invite the Deputy Leader Opposite to close out the top of the House.
Okay, so we start by on this side of the house by saying that we believe that human rights, twinned with human development and environmental protection laws, are more effective in achieving long-term environment and human sustainability. Now, first of all, we want to do some rebuttals before we get into our substantive. We heard about environment. We kept on hearing on this side of the house environmental protection, which we can believe is still not attacking the essence of the motion, which is giving nature rights. Because here's the thing: the environmental protection does not exist in isolation from human development. And why we believe that we actually believe that human rights and human development agendas have a more direct correlation in preserving the environment than just giving nature rights, which exist in isolation. Because when you just give nature rights, it does not take into account really and truly human involvement. But when it is that you give human rights, it's a more holistic perspective. Actually, when it is a more holistic perspective in actually achieving the long-term environmental sustainability that we want. Now, we kept on hearing this argument about small island developing states, etc. But the reality is that giving nature rights actually does not solve the problem, because most of the environmental problems that happen in small island developing countries are actually not by the locals. They're actually by developing countries who are actually the one contributing to the carbon footprint and other business structures that actually happen in these countries. And they already define the rights of the people or the laws in the country. So we don't know why is it that we think that mechanizing that they're actually going to more comply with these rights. Now, on this side, we actually think what is lacking is actually an analysis as to why constitutional entrenchment is actually the best way to go. Now, we believe, first of all, constitutional entrenchment is actually very stoic, and it is actually very clear-cut, and it is hard to actually deal with the ever-evolving issues or ever-evolving nature of environmental issues. Now, let's give you an example of what we mean by this. Now, on our side of the house, we're going to show you. On their side of the house, they're going to say, okay, we're going to give this entire land nature rights. Listen, you cannot touch the trees, because some of the rights that were mentioned were like rights to procreate, etc. So you can't touch the trees. Versus on our side of the house, well, listen, the people in the community actually want economic empowerment. So yes, you can cut down the trees, but you have to grow them back. It's simple. That's what we're saying on our side of the house. That the human rights must be intact. Human rights and development actually lead to more environmental protection. And even if we speak about the water issue, it is more easy. It's actually easier because there's actually easier to bring a claim about persons living in the community than actually someone being convinced or policymakers being convinced that we must simply save land just for simply saving land's sake. Because we believe that politically they are more going to act when it is that they realize that humans are involved, or simply just the species, the protected species in an area. Now, first of all, we want to actually talk about how it is going to be mechanized. Because on our side of the house, mechanization is a big clash in this debate. Because on our side of the house, we're showing you how human rights has years and years of precedent and how it is that we protect human beings. Versus how is it that we protect human beings, especially in correlation to the environment. Versus on their side of the house, where they want to establish a whole new area of the law, that doesn't have much established precedents internationally and locally. And we actually think that is actually time bound. We actually think our side actually is more likely to achieve time bound achievements rather than on their side of the house. We also believe that in many of these developing countries, these land rights and these nature rights can actually hamper development. Now, why we believe that this will hamper development? The reality is that in many developing countries, sacrifices have to be made that will affect nature. Sacrifices that will have to be made that will affect nature. That we believe that entrenching the rights does not actually facilitate consultation. Now, we're going to get into that more after I accept this point of information.
So, if it's so important for the environment for development, when does that end point come? I.e., China is one of the most well-developed countries in the nation and still exploits the environment on a daily basis. So when do we stop exploiting?
Well, here's the thing. When do you actually stop exploiting? When you actually realize that humans are being affected. That's reality. human beings are not affected, if human beings are not affected, they're actually not going to care about whether or not they should exploit it or not. Now, we actually believe that even in the consultation process, it's actually more furthered when it is that we have environmental protection laws and human rights. Let's explain to you what we mean by that. Now, on their side of the house is rights, which is just very stoic, which actually makes it easy for environmental groups to just shut down development that might actually harm the environment and actually prevent even companies from developing simply because of these rights. On our side of the house, what we're actually proposing is that when you have these human rights and specific environmental laws that are not constitutionally entrenched, you actually allow for consultation, which actually can allow for a middle ground. So let's put it this way. Let's say when you see that policymakers go to the table, they will say, okay, we have these laws, but we also realize human rights and human development have goals. So what we're going to do, we're going to see how best can we mitigate the issues instead of just blocking the overall development, because we actually think that is better. You get development and you get so much of a destruction to the environment, but still persons being empowered economically, rather than on their side of the house where it is that simply we're just going to protect these lands because we want to protect the trees and want to protect animals, and animals should be able to procreate. And we actually don't know who is it benefiting when they speak about fishing protection. If animals are not able to procreate and persons are in a fishing village, they actually eat the fishes, so they actually need to fish for the fishes. So we actually don't know how that actually helps anyone. So their argument really and truly actually doesn't make any sense. Now, we're going to also show you why it is that we actually believe that mitigation is actually a better way to go about environmental protection. Because we actually realize that, especially in developing states, climate change mitigation is more important, because what it does is that we already realize that climate change is already inevitable. And we realize that for many of these countries, what they really and truly need is mitigation, and actually not need lands to be protected. Because many of their lands, one, are already fully exploited, or if they're not exploited, even if they're not exploited, they're already affected by the effects of global climate change. What the focus really and truly needs to be is how can we use these lands in a sustainable way? How can we use these lands in a sustainable way without actually blocking long-term investment? Now, we're going to give you an example. For instance, when we see that we actually protect lands and resources that are in quote-unquote nature, we realize, let's go. We have a major oil field in our country. It's blocked by environmental rights rather than environmental protection. Now, what we're seeing, especially with innovations in environment, with environmental rights, it just blocks it. With environmental protection, with human rights, what happens is that the new innovations in technology and environmental protection, you can have both development and environmental protection, and that's what we're seeing on this side of the house.
The problem with the top half of this debate is similar to the problem in the status quo, that we focus too much on using nature as a means to an end rather than seeing nature as an equal. That's going to be our extension from opposing government, that when you create a symbiotic relationship that considers nature on the same level as humans, you make it, one, easier to address problems in the long term because people no longer see nature as some one-off problem to solve in the future, but B, you make it easier to create solutions that can actually change the climate in the real world today. But before I get to that, I want to talk to you about, one, some outstanding pieces of rebuttal coming from opening opposition, and then two, what lawsuits actually look like, because I just think we never get an explanation about what that looks like in the status quo. Let's talk about development on their side of the house, because I think it's very important to note that while we do want to protect human rights, right, we would say those are equal, you can still have that on our side of the house, meaning that if you still want to pass policies that ensure that people have protections from exploitation within the environment, those things can still happen on our side of the house. They never explain to you why that also doesn't happen in their world. But B, I think if you want to live in a world in which we're just just unsustainably developing and hoping that countries at some point come to a realization that they're doing harm. I think that you can just gut check this within the status quo, where you see tons of countries just continuously exploiting the environment and often saying, well, we'll get to it eventually, right? And that's how we come up with these predictions that always get pushed off into the future, 10, 20, 30, 50 years, and we never see any sort of change. We think that that's the world they live in. But let's take them at their best case and say it does harm development in some of these nations. We think that's probably a good thing at the point in which you're probably making it easier for individuals to live their lives on a daily basis, i.e. if you're no longer having to deal with things like smog, if you're no longer having to deal with like water crises, we think that's probably a better life for you to live in on the forefront, especially when a lot of the development is massively unequal in terms of where it goes. We think on their side of the house, you just make it worse for individuals writ large. What do we think lawsuits look like? Because I don't think we ever get a discussion about that on the top half of this debate, i.e. just because a lawsuit says that you must stop an action does not mean that you cannot develop at all, right? We think that there are tons of ways in which lawsuits function within the status quo. There are things like declaratory statements that say we don't support these sorts of policies. There are things like financial damages that can be paid back to individuals, which means you probably can still benefit them in some capacity. There are a variety of things that happen in the status quo. I don't think the characterization of we're just going to stop massive amounts of development within these nations is a particularly generous characterization, and I think it's important to keep those things in mind when we talk about our extension. Let's talk about the principle in terms of why we think it's important to have a symbiotic relationship between nature and people, because I want you to look to the status quo right now. Because we live in a world in which individuals think one of three things. One, they don't think climate change is an issue. Two, they think that it's only a concern up until a point to where we can get it to where humans can start exploiting again. Or three, people just see nature as a means to the end, i.e. the top half of this debate. I think it's very interesting that the whole conversation about nature's important, but only until the point that it affects humans is a really senile way of looking at the environment, because the environment is literally what's created life on Earth, right? It's something that has existed prior to us, coming onto this Earth, and will probably exist when we go extinct, right? I think it's important to create a characterization in which we see nature as one with each other, and we think that only happens when you codify it within the law that says that humans and nature have equal rights, and that it's important to evaluate them both equally, right? Why do we think that's important? One, we think it probably makes it, why do we think this is a good thing? One, we think it probably makes it easier to combat things like climate change in the long term. Two ways. First, on the micro level, because you can actually hold individuals accountable for the things that they do, i.e. when tons of drunk college kids go to spring break, for example, in these nations that don't have protections against the environment, right? It makes it very easy for them to completely trash the ozone, for example, and there's no accountability. We think there's probably better for individuals to be able to sue those individuals on the basis of harming nature so that you can actually prevent that sort of behavior. But second, on a macro level, we think it's just important to create collective action where people can actually create things like class action lawsuits and can codify, catalyze together in order to address nature as a totality, right? i.e. if a corporation has a serious problem with fracking within your community, we think it's probably better for you to be able to sue on the basis of nature, because it's not something that can just be one-off, right? It probably gives you more ground in court, right? Right now, too many individuals have to go on the basis of things like discrimination, right? But we don't think that those things actually create the change necessary. I think when you create a relationship that says these two are the same, it makes it very hard for you then to deny them the same rights within nature. Second reason why we think this is a good thing. We think it's important to catalyze support for the green movement, right? Because I think the green movement has a lot of positive aspects of it in terms of its push for environmental policies that actually make it to where we can have sustainable development. But the issue is that a lot of their victories aren't practical ones, right? They aren't ones that can actually delineate success. Why is this important then that we codify nature within law? We think it's important because it provides a legitimacy that actually gets people involved within the system, right? i.e. when I see that nature actually has a place in society and that individuals in nature should be considered equal, it makes it easier for us to get people to actually support the green movement. So even if you don't think the lawsuits are successful, right? Even in our worst case, it probably makes it easier if they settle out of court, right? Because there's still probably some financial restitution that I'll get, so which means I can still invest in trying to solve the problems within my community. But B, we probably think it makes it people more cognizant of the role in which nature plays in their lives, because they're seen as equal, because it's never seen as a means to an end in our world. We think that is the principal argument, right? They need to explain to us in any of the solutions that they can provide why we don't delineate nature from humans. I think at the point in which we can win that argument, we probably win the round, because it means that the only way you get any sort of long-term change is in our world, because there's no longer justification for treating these things differently. But before I get to my last point in terms of how we protect weak communities, I'll take opening.
Whether you like it or not, humans use the environment as a tool for their growth and development. And the fact that you were talking about earlier, businesses, environmental rights actually discourage the establishment of businesses and therefore rapid economic growth, especially for poor countries.
Yeah, I can deal with that, but I think what we're saying is that to some extent, nature does play a role in society. We're saying that that relationship is symbiotic, meaning it's not something that you can just exploit and then say we need to get down to a point so we can exploit again. It's how do we make sure that nature actually has a place in society, right? We think that's fundamentally different on your side of the house. Let's talk about companies, let's talk about the individuals, right? Because those are the people that are going to be impacted. Why do we think we still probably benefit companies in terms of their behavior in the long term? I.e., if these lawsuits are successful, they're going to have to change their behavior. They're probably going to invest in different markets in order to still make a profit. That's why massive amounts of green tech innovation is happening, because you're forcing companies to change their behaviors. We think that happens more often on our side of the house when you actually hold people accountable. But the second thing under this is that even if they do switch to worse products, those things have higher startup costs, they have lower returns on investments, which means they're unsustainable within the long term, which means they're still going to have to switch. How do we benefit individuals? Because right now, not enough people have the capacity to actually create a stance in which nature is seen as one with us. We think we fundamentally change that on our side of the house. I think the comparative is there are a lot of solutions that can be proposed within this motion in terms of how we address the environment. I think no one's going to come up here and say the environment isn't important, but I think it's about how do we change the way in which we see it. I think we fundamentally gain access to a more broader reach and a more substantive reach on our side of the house, because we're no longer seeing it as a means to an end. Rather, we see it as something that is equal to us. For all these reasons, we're very proud to propose.
He thanks the member government for their remarks. Vice.
I'm trying to figure this out with the reverb. What? We're just trying to figure out that situation. Like,
Yeah, that's fine. Should I wait?
Yes.
I'd rather not.
Yes.
I hope the feedback is not terrible. Is everyone good? I think it's bizarre that OG starts this debate by coming up and giving you an emotional appeal to kids with asthma, an emotion in which they are literally defending giving trees rights, not insofar as they help prevent your kid from breathing, but insofar as trees have intrinsic rights as they relate to other things in their ecosystem and as trees. Understand that most of what we have heard up and down the Gov bench is a description of how environmental protections work in the status quo. That is to say, things like smog regulations that relate to kids with asthma are exactly the kinds of regulations that are grounded in an understanding of the existing humanist conception of rights that undergirds almost every legal system in almost every aspect of their laws, right? Which probably means the courtroom cases they're talking about are now on their side of the house, and what they have to defend, and what I don't think Gov's been defending most of these cases, is cases that are decided by the right of nature not to be destroyed, the right of nature to not have its interlocking parts move. They're mostly just describing the status quo, but understand that this debate doesn't let them fiat that all countries suddenly pass more progressive environmental protections. It means that this debate is now about what happens when countries pass environmental protections and how that ought to be done, and whether that should be done by enshrining the environment in itself or viewing the environment as it relates to humans. What's the extension? We're going to explain why they represent an aesthetic privileging of the environment that causes us to view humanity as something that is distinct from nature, and why in the court cases they talk about, that translates into court cases that are unwinnable for people who are viewed as encroaching on nature. It makes it impossible to get political discourse that gets us things like Extinction Rebellion that actually create productive change. First, a few pieces of rebuttal. First, this is very extraneous, but I just wanted to flag that OG has put themselves in a really real double bind here, where they argue that the overarching principle of like rights as human rights is not going to change on their side of the house. If that is true, they get no solvency and are not meaningfully different than the status quo, and I don't know what new discourse they access. If that's not true, if that's not true, then it is the case that they are now privileging discussions that talk about the environment as the environment. It means they don't access all the benefits of appeals to humanity which exists in the status quo. Secondly, I want to flag the argument up and down the gov bench that status quo environmental regulations are really bad, so therefore it must be necessary to make some sort of change. We agree in general that obviously environmental protections are bad, but understand that their change is not one that intrinsically makes countries care more about the environment, insofar as most people have more of an intuition for human rights than they do for some abstract amount of human rights. Rather, we think this just puts them in a mechanistic debate where now you are having people enshrine protections or non-enshrine protections for different reasons. Thirdly, I want to answer CG specifically when they make the argument about how it's uniquely good to have people view themselves as one with and same as nature. This is probably the status quo when you look at the majority of regulations that exist, insofar as now these regulations are talking about how it's really, really important to stop Arctic drilling because sea level rise is going to affect people thousands and thousands of miles away. It's probably important to understand that those laws also relate to, for example, helping the Inuit people, as opposed to some intrinsic right that ICE has, which I think is what their side of the house has to defend in at least some instances. Opening.
We think you can still enshrine rights in our world, the world that essentially exists, where you do have people that are advocating that existing with humanity is key. The difference is on your side of the house, you need to advocate why there should not be a rights system for things like the environment.
No, you don't. You just have to advocate it through the lens of humanity. I think insofar as we understand all the research that points to the necessitation of humanity as a way to avoid things like existential threats like extinction, that is where you get the actual collective action movements that the government bench seems so concerned with. I think that is a debate on our side of the house. What do we think their world looks like? We think insofar as CG is right that OG needs to talk about the mechanisms and lawsuits of this debate, and obviously don't, and it's therefore probably frames himself out of the debate. I think the lawsuits that are happening, and when you use lawsuits as a mechanism, are uniquely bad for a couple of reasons. One, understand that OG said that these regulations are necessarily going to be vague, because as OO tells us, environmental concerns are fluid, and there needs to be some way to privilege the rights of trees in a way that is more codifiable than, and a nature cop saw you cutting down a tree the other day. What this means is that the cases we are going to be looking at are, yes, they're going to tell you cases where we take it against wealthy people for engaging in unethical development or deforestation. First of all, deforestation cases can probably happen on either side of the house because the defense against deforestation regulations is mostly related to human breathing concerns. But secondly, we think something else is much more likely. We think the inverse of what will happen is that because this side of the house is one where the law now privileges nature as an aesthetic object that exists independent of things like human encroachment, what's going to happen is you are now going to get wealthy individuals getting angry when there are development in rural regions or development in developing countries that encroaches on, for example, their seaside view, that encroaches on, that engages in urban sprawl instead of building up, which is something only they have the unique privilege to do. We think disproportionately the big man is probably going to win these lawsuits for a couple of reasons. The first is just lawsuits always privilege those who can afford more lawyers and have more money. The second is legal capture, which means even if they don't win these cases based on the letter of the law, they can drag them out indefinitely. And the third is just they don't have a lot of opponents, because understand that they are relying on people who naturally have an sense of activism and intuition for the environment as it pertains to the environment. People who care about fish because they like fish, not because they like people's ability to survive on fish and not starve. That's an incredibly small percentage of environmental activists. That's not what things like Extinction Rebellion active access, which I think means they're far, far worse than the status quo, because now their law demand depends on vague aesthetic appeals in extremely generic legal terms that are going to be open to abuse by well-trained lawyers who can make appeals as to why, for example, this low-income community building a new seaside development, or this indigenous group trying to continue to develop on their land and improve their standard of living, are violating the environment because they're supposed to be living in harmony with it. They're supposed to not be violating environmental tenets. This is the discourse we get out from them. Why is our discourse much better, right? We think the SQO is imperfect, but we think the SQO is accessing some significantly better change when it privileges these discussions insofar as as there are human ones. We think our side is one where countries are able to access things like Extinction Rebellion, which go up and make demands to change all of the negative things that affect nature, be they broader emissions that might not affect you in your town, might only affect people far across the world in some vague way you can understand, but do viscerally affect your own ability to live, your future children's ability to live, something that they don't access in those sorts of legal precedents or cases they get. Our side is one where Arctic drilling laws exist because they might hurt native persons who you are never going to meet, but those persons are still people, and because humanism and universal collective humanism, especially in an age in which the globalization of cultural values is mostly favored like Enlightenment era Western values, means it's easy to make an intuitive plea to our collective humanity, right? It means that you're finally getting people who care about these laws, even in places like China, who on their side of the house is not going to have citizen activists in the majority of cases who have some like emotional appeal to make to nature, but has a lot of people who are concerned about rising smog levels, which means even insofar as China is probably not progressive environmentally as it could be on either side of the house and is a large emitter. On our side, they can do the things that we see them doing in the status quo, like getting rid, like having punitive smog emissions and helping people collectively. Is our side of the house self-interest? Maybe in some sort of collective humanistic sense, but we think that's far, far better than depending on a world of broad regulations and a system of adjudication that will always privilege the big man versus some sort of nebulous sense of citizen activism where people who have their rights taken away from them constantly have no ability to legally advocate like individual citizens and indigenous populations find themselves stripped of their right because of some abstract notion of encroaching on nature. Proud to oppose.
Sorry, lots of paper as you can see. Honorable panel, our case is quite simple. Sure, the states, the companies, they might not care enough about companies right now. They might care a little bit more about human beings. We say combine the two, combine the power, make the threat more important, and make them have to care, right? All right, three things I'm going to be doing in this speech. First, I want to go over the extension that we just got from closing opposition, just going down and rebutting some of the ideas that we just heard. Then I'm going to reiterate the principle, which I think is not adequately responded to, talking about why particularly we are catalyzing these companies having to care by literally creating a symbiotic relationship and equating nature to human beings, which makes it doubly dangerous, right? Then going down the flow of what we hear on top half. Okay, so let's talk about this extension that we hear, right? The first thing that we hear out of closing opposition is the idea that, well, current environmental regulations already exist, right? And so like we say, oh, and also like countries are not going to care because they still like value humans more. We say like one, recognize that these states are going to start losing their humans. Like that is the alternative that they're literally facing, is a world where humans are going to be dying because water levels are rising, because food shortages are rising, right? Because they don't have jobs, because they don't have enough stability in the status quo. So we think that's like humans, you know, if it takes humans starting to leave, like that is happening right now, the states still don't like really care enough, right? We think that we need to make these humans even more weaponized, right? We also say like we now have recourse for the state not caring about nature. That is to say, when the state or when these companies are not showing a considerable like amount of care, they're going to have recourse. Like, no, these are companies that we're talking about largely, which are, yes, they're in charge of development and they have that as an incentive, but they're also capitalists, which means that when these costs grow, when these costs climb, which is inevitably like going to happen when people start suing them, they're going to have to start paying attention, right? So no, the money incentive is a big one, right? But also we hear this idea that, well, like these cases are going to get easily absolved by lawyers, and it's not likely that anybody's going to pursue. One, like, look at how society has typically responded to an opportunity to get money out of a legal case, right? When you see those commercials for a law firm, it's like, hey, have you experienced this thing? Call this number so you can get some free money. People jump on top of that, right? Sure, maybe the humans don't care about fish, but they are going to care about money. So at the point in time which they're saying you can get a lawsuit, you can get some free money just by going out and policing the environment and seeing what's wrong, humans are certainly going to want to do this, right? But like even in the case where we get settlements because they have better lawyers, right? At least you're still giving money to these green movements, right? I think that that's important on the comparative. Even if they refuse to stop the development of infrastructure, we think they're going to have to do so through a settlement, which is going to give money to these green movements, which further empowers them to push their narratives and gives them more power to change the status quo, right? But also, like, to this idea that the status quo is better, not right now, to this idea that the status quo is better, they literally say up and down opposition bets that states currently don't care. We all know that water levels are rising, but Trump just pulled out of the Paris climate agreements. Like, obviously, states are not doing this on their own, and we need to increase the threat in importance. We tell you that we do that through our extension, which says that we are literally equating the two. We are now making it so that you can't care about humans or nature. Rather, you have to think of nature as a human being, and it's something that you have to be considerate of, right? Like notice in history, like states have always been, or countries have always been hesitant to try and grant human rights. But as the attempts persist, and as the protests rise, and as you have more cases of it being brought forward, it becomes apparent to them that you can't ignore this forever, right? We're literally just making the threat bigger, making the importance bigger by teaming these two up, right? Nature and humans. Like we also say that so let's go over the extension, right? I think this principle is very, very important. I have a new sort of principle to respond to their extension, which talks a little bit about development in developing countries and how this is going to inhibit them. We think that principally we're okay with putting a halt on development, even in developing countries, okay? Because it's oftentimes, development in developing countries that's not green is coming at the expense of the people within those countries. We told you that things like smog, food decreases, overcrowding, things like increased emissions, which leads to higher temperatures, rising waters, and cities going underwater, right? The alternative is these cities literally not existing, right? But also note a little bit of nuance here is that if we're talking about developing areas, these are the areas that oftentimes are going to experience these things worse and first, right? So we know that there's dumping going on. We know that they have the least amount of voice in the status quo to get these changes. So they're going to experience these environmental harms worse. They're going to have the least amount of voice to actually get some sort of reciprocity out of it, right? But secondly, closing.
Sure, this is not the debate. In the status quo, you can sue for dumping if it hurts you as a person. You are simply changing a mechanism so that now it's based on some abstract harm to the environment that these people are less likely to value.
So the point is that we can just increase the number of suits that are happening, which means that these companies are going to have to start paying attention. It's very simple. This is the debate. Okay, let's talk about the principle of why we are opposed to separation of nature and humans, right? It's only when we see nature as a human being that we have to preserve nature the same way we try to preserve human beings, right? So insofar as they agree that we care about humans right now and that we do that through development of infrastructure, etc., we think that we're fundamentally opposed to delineation of nature and humans because it's always going to come at the expense of nature, right? That is to say that right now they're currently prioritizing humans. When we have more of these cases being brought forward by humans, they now start to see the synonymousness of human beings in nature, right? All humans are going to start caring about nature, even if they don't really care because they just want some money out of it, right? We say that those selfish incentives are a good thing too because you're still calling attention to, for companies' attention to these problems. Right? Recognize that also it's just fundamentally not okay to separate the two. We are a part of nature. Nature is we were born from this earth, we need trees to breathe, we think that we are connected and that the state ought to recognize that, right? What else are we bringing from CG? This idea that as long as nature or also that we empower people to address the environment, right? Which is particularly helpful to developing countries. And also we tell you 3 reasons why companies are gonna have to change. One, because of the huge amount of expenses when people are gonna jump on top of this opportunity. Also because companies have it's not going to be cost efficient for them to maintain these archaic energy sources or archaic methods, right? When the rest of the industry starts to advance, they're going to have to advance too. And 3, even if they settle and don't do anything, they're still giving money over to green movements, okay? Let's go over top half. What does OG tell us now? What does OG tell us? They tell us, one, states are not going to, states don't currently care and it's why we do this, right? Government is telling you more, right? We have to question what relationship is necessary to catalyze this company's caring. We say, CG particularly says, it's the unique relationship is one where humans are likened to nature, and that happens when humans start weaponizing nature more, right? But also, OG tells us, well, companies are gonna have to change their practices, right? CG tells you particularly what both worlds look like. One, if companies do go green, then we just have a better quality of life, which is better for human beings. But 2, if they don't go green, then they default to settlements, which is just going to give more money to green movements, right? The impact is more money for green movements, or they're going to accrue costs if they don't change because they're now archaic in their methodologies, right? Lastly, let's go over opening opposition. So what does opening opposition bring us? Well, it brings the idea that, environmental groups are going to be less effective. One, like they're literally giving money and attention to these movements. Two, these companies are being helped by like the more cautiousness of these like developmental companies. Three, the threat and the importance of nature overall is going to be much heightened. And like four, notice that like these groups and everyone everywhere is not going to exist if we don't start stepping up the pressure, right? And also to this idea that like states are going to start caring when humans are being effective. Like recognize that we literally know that like and not very long Miami might be underwater. Trump still pulls out of the Paris climate agreements. It's clear that states don't care right now. We say that we need to weaponize more. We say that we need more threat. Very proud to propose.
Please make the government whip and invite the opposition whip to close out the debate as a whole.
The latest estimates say we have about 10 years in order to fix climate change, or else humanity is likely to go extinct or experience an extreme change in the way that our life works. We think we need to be putting everything that we can into fighting this, and we think that this policy does not do that in the most effective way possible. What I think we need to prove in this debate is that their policy doesn't work and is not effective in stopping this type of catastrophe or even in the small scale change that they want, and that it has harms that we are not willing to trade off with. I think Nate does both of those things in his speech. In this speech, I'm going to first talk about the principle and why we think they haven't done a good enough job justifying why it exists. Then talk about how both OG's policy and CG's different conception of how it would work do not have positive impacts and in fact could lead to the entrenchment of harmful environmental policies. And then talk about why we think there's going to be practical harms from this policy existing. So first, on the principle. Opening government tries to prove principled reasons why the environment has rights. Their ideas are an obligation to citizens, collective rights of humans, and the rights of future humans. Those are all still based on the rights of people, as I point out in my POI. Then they say, oh, you can have both and this can be layered, which becomes the entire govline in this debate. We think it's really difficult to prove that the environment has harms. There's a reason that they weren't able to do it in 7 minutes. It's also extremely difficult to prove that humans should have rights when you start from first principles and try to build up. However, it's much more intuitive to tell people that humans should have rights because we all want to live in a world where people are treated well and where people are able to access the right or access the things that they need in order to live. And we think that that's generally what people have begun to accept now. We think we need a change that is fast and radical, which is why Nate tells you about the Extinction Rebellion, which is a huge movement happening in the UK right now, where they're saying people are likely to go extinct. That is an unacceptable harm. We need our governments to be taking action absolutely right now. We think arguing based on a notion of human rights is much better because first, it's already what's entrenched within the legal system and it's already what people believe. Recognize that what they're doing in their side of the house, their mechanism, is entrenching, is putting this one law into the Constitution that allows people to sue on behalf of the environment. They don't get any mechanism for changing how people in society view these policies or view the environment. They don't give us any real reason why that would happen. Closing government tries to do this and says that by putting this in the Constitution, it means it's going to filter down to people caring, but we have lots of things entrenched in constitutions that people don't believe in, and lots of things that people don't follow through in policies. Even putting human rights within your constitution doesn't necessitate that means everyone is going to have access to the things you may think that they should deserve. We think we need to be prioritizing ways in which you can get real change that help people in the long term and help stop the catastrophe of climate change that we are going to get if we do nothing or if we dilly-dally trying to protect forests and forget or see the trees instead of the forest. We think that is a big harm. Okay, so why do we think there's an active trade-off happening in this debate, and why do we think that there's a harm to this policy existing? First, because we think opening government tells us that it's going to be vague in construction because it's like leaves room for advocacy groups to push for what they most want. We think that a vaguely constructed law is a very dangerous one because it means the team with the most lawyers and the most money is usually able to get their way, but also it leaves more room for the social narrative and what people already believe to filter into how the law is applied. We think that means they're not going to get the best conception that you could get from Gov in the way that you're protecting these forests and these environments. I think it's been rather confusing what exactly they're advocating for in Gov because of this, because we're not sure what this is going to look like. But who do we think is going to actually be doing this suing? And we get kind of very little conception of this from OG and a lot more from CG. This is what they flag as their extension. And it tells you that there are probably two groups who might actually be trying to take advantage of this new policy. First, there could be advocacy groups or individuals who are trying to make a difference and fight for the environment, either because they really care about the environment intrinsically, because they want to protect people, or because they believe forests have an ability to live and exist, or they want the oceans to continue existing into the future. We think first it's likely, in a lot of places, environmental groups are not looked upon favorably, even though we recognize that there might be massive harm to humans in the future because of the environment, and we think it's likely that they're going to be kind of mocked and not looked upon favorably, and you're going to lose momentum for the environmental movement overall. It's much better to argue for it from a human rights perspective, but also from an economic benefit perspective, going into the long term, how we're better able to provide long-term stable economies and stable world for people. But we also think that they're quite likely to lose because of the vague construction of these laws, and because the organizations or companies that they're likely to be suing are probably quite rich, especially if you're talking about large-scale issues like oil companies or deforestation. Right now, when you're trying to sue on behalf of humans, which in the status quo already is allowed, they often lose because it's very difficult to prove, one, that the company you're trying to target actually caused the harm, because international law makes it very difficult in order to target the ones who are actually at fault, and those are all ways where it makes it difficult for them to actually get the advocacy that they say. But I also think that it's quite likely that they're going to lose, which could create harmful legal precedent, which makes it so that you can't, so a law gets entrenched that it's okay for oil companies to be doing the extractive policies that they're doing now, which is what you see in the status quo when humans are suing on behalf of humans. We think it's fine to allow people to continue suing on behalf of humans and have that happening concurrently, but we want the environmental movement to be unified with a core message about protecting humanity and prioritizing environmental movement into the future. I'll take over.
We think the problem is just because rights aren't always enforced doesn't change the fact that they are still rights, and also that on the status quo, companies can literally just have a negligence charge when they pollute water that causes humans to die. On our side, they actually are charged for literally polluting the water itself. Is that not a better world?
Okay, so you didn't model very clearly how this is going to work, the differences between negligence charges or criminal charges, if the environment is a human or not. We're not super sure about that, but we think that this debate probably exists less in the principled world and more in how we actually solve the problems on the ground. We think that it's unlikely you're going to win these cases as easily. Okay, so then Nate also tells you about how it's also likely that people who value the environment aesthetically, who value their backyard and the forest near them, or who value large swathes of wilderness continuing to exist, are likely to be doing things like suing people who are wanting to build development, low-income housing often faces problems where people don't want their view to be diminished, and so they'll want to prevent that from happening. This provides them a mechanism as well for trying to protect the aesthetic beauty of nature, or the environment that surrounds them directly, rather than prioritizing things that we might care about equally or care about more, depending on which conception of whether we value the environment more or less than humans that you want to talk about. So we think that's going to also harm people directly. We think it's a great idea to value the environment. We think it's great to say that nature should have some kind of value. But when you talk about enshrining this into a constitution, making this something that we base a large amount of the environmental movement on, we don't think that's something that is going to have positive impacts. We think it's going to have direct harm to people who we want to care about the most, and we think it's not going to create a long-term movement that can solve the global problems that we need to be caring about the most. Thank you, and proud to oppose.